It was a morning that started like any other emergency call. A man picks up the phone and dials 911. He tells the dispatcher that a 3-year-old boy in his care has gone missing from his apartment in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. The call is calm, almost too calm. Then, 1 minute after he hangs up, a text message arrives on his phone. "Say you guys were taking a nap and he left." That is a direct quote from court documents. The message came from the boy's own mother, and it did not stop there. According to investigators, she continued texting. "Jesse, listen, the way you word things is very important. 1 minute." That is all the time it took before anyone had even begun looking for her son.
911, what's your emergency?
Before an Amber Alert had been issued, before a single volunteer had stepped outside, the boy's mother was already coaching the man who last had him on what to say to police. That boy was Elijah Vue, 3 years old. Blonde hair, brown eyes, red and green dinosaur slip-on shoes. He was never seen alive again. This is the story that most people only caught in headlines, but the headlines did not tell you about the text messages, stretching back months. They did not tell you about what investigators found on a phone that had already been deleted, and they did not tell you what a child abuse specialist said, on record, after reviewing the full case file. That word. The one that changes everything. You will hear it before this video is over. 2 years before February 20th, 2024, a little boy named Elijah Vue was born into a life that held the same ordinary promise every child's life holds. Elijah was 3 years old at the time of his disappearance. He still used a bottle. He was not yet potty trained. He was, by every measure, a toddler, a small child who needed the things all small children need: protection, warmth, consistency, the reassurance that the adults around him were safe. He had dark blonde hair that reporters would describe over and over in the months that followed. He had brown eyes. He carried a red and white plaid blanket, the kind of blanket a 3-year-old drags everywhere, the kind that becomes a comfort object, a stand-in for safety when everything else feels uncertain. His father later stood in a courtroom and said, "We need answers." And I think Katrina Bauer has the answer. His aunt created a Facebook page called Old Remembering Elijah Vue. Within months of his disappearance, that page would become a place where a community tried to hold on to a child who had already been taken from them in every way that mattered. But in January of 2024, Elijah Vue was just a boy. A 3-year-old boy with dinosaur shoes and a blanket who had, according to his mother, some behavioral problems that needed correcting. And that is where this story gets complicated, because the decision his mother made about how to correct those problems is what led to everything that came after. Katrina Bauer was 31 years old. She had begun dating a man named Jesse Vang. In November of 2023, Vang was 39. According to investigators, Bauer had actually dated Vang once before, roughly a year prior to 2023. But the renewed relationship moved quickly. By January of 2024, she was sending her son to stay with this man. Not for an overnight, not for a weekend. For extended stays, increasingly longer. With increasingly less oversight, Bauer later told detectives that she wanted Vang to teach Elijah, by example, how to be a man. She said she had spoken to Vang about the limits of what discipline she would and would not allow. Think about what that means for a moment. She acknowledged there was a framework for how far discipline could go. She knew there were limits to set. She knew the length to sets, and she sent her 3-year-old son anyway. By February 12th of 2024, Elijah had been with Vang continuously for a week. It was the longest stretch Elijah had ever spent with Vang without his mother present. According to investigators, Bauer planned to pick him up on February 23rd. She would never get the chance, but this decision, the choice to send a toddler to stay with a man she had known for just a few months, was not made in a vacuum. The text messages between Bauer and Vang in the weeks before Elijah disappeared paint a picture of what daily life looked like in that apartment. This is the part that most people never heard. Investigators recovered text messages and social media conversations between Bauer and Vang going back to at least December of 2023. The messages were entered into court documents. Some of them had been deleted. They were recovered anyway. On January 31st at 10:19 in the morning, Vang sent a message saying he had woken up to some noise and found that Elijah had his phone, his tablet, and his Nintendo Switch. He told Bauer he was furious. He said that since Elijah had learned nothing, he could stay longer. Bauer replied that Elijah was still a toddler and had temptations. Vang's response was that Elijah's punishment would be cold water. At 11:41 the same morning, Bauer asked what Elijah was doing. Vang said Elijah was in a standing timeout, saying, "Good boy." Bauer suggested letting him watch television because Vang needed to rest. Vang disagreed, said Elijah could not be trusted out of his sight. At 4:26 in the afternoon, Vang messaged that he did not think Elijah was ready to go home, that he was done with his lying. Bauer asked whether Vang thought a 3-year-old even understood what lying was. That exchange, that small, ordinary back and forth, is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire case, because buried inside it is a mother who sees the absurdity of punishing a toddler for lying, but does not pull her son out of that apartment. The clock was already ticking. Neither of them seemed to hear it. According to prosecutors, Elijah was subjected to standing timeouts lasting 1 to 3 hours, during which time he was required to pray or repeat, "I'm sorry, Mommy." He was not allowed to play with the one toy he had brought to the apartment. He was mostly bottle-fed. He was not potty-trained, and yet investigators would later note that he was being punished for accidents. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense. On February 20th, 2024, at approximately 8 in the morning, Elijah Vue was last seen alive. Jesse Vang told police that after he gave Elijah some instructions, he lay down to take a nap. When he woke up, sometime between 11 and noon, Elijah was gone. He called 911. 1 minute later, that text message arrived from Katrina Bauer. An Amber Alert was issued that afternoon. Two Rivers is a small city in Manitowoc County, a working lakeside community on the western shore of Lake Michigan. It is not a large city. Word spread fast. Within hours, people were out searching. Bauer arrived at Vang's apartment at around 3:15 that afternoon. When investigators spoke with her, she told them she had not been in Two Rivers between February 12th and February 20th. She said she had been in the Wisconsin Dells area, but her cell phone data said otherwise. I mean, think about that for a second. Before the first evening of the search had even ended, investigators already had a woman whose alibi, its eyes, did not match her phone location data. Sant Ammer, a man whose story contained a napping adult and a missing toddler, and no explanation for how a 3-year-old who was allegedly afraid of him had managed to unlock an apartment door and walk out into a Wisconsin winter morning alone. Both Katrina Bauer and Jesse Vang were arrested on February 26th on charges of felony child neglect. Bauer also faced 2 misdemeanor counts of resisting or obstructing an officer. The search for Elijah was just beginning. The weeks that followed February 20th turned Two Rivers into a community consumed by a single question. Where is Elijah? Volunteers came out in numbers. Drone operators offered their equipment. The FBI deployed aerial searches over Manitowoc County. Utility crews helped investigators search manholes throughout the area. A $15,000 FBI reward was announced for information leading to Elijah's recovery. That amount later grew. By the early summer, 3 separate reward pools had combined to reach $40,000. Tips came in from across the country. Investigators followed them. They searched fields, wooded areas, waterways. They asked the public to help track a Nissan Altima that Vang had borrowed from a neighbor in the days before Elijah was reported missing. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The neighbor who loaned Vang the car, said he had stopped by the apartment. He did not see Elijah when he was there. That Nissan Altima would become central to what investigators pieced together next, because surveillance cameras in Two Rivers had caught something the night before Elijah was reported missing. February 19th, 2024. The night before the 911 call. The cameras showed Jesse Vang driving that borrowed Nissan to the parking area of a St. Vincent de Paul thrift store. He got out of the car. He set a suitcase down near the side door. According to investigators, he paused, looked back at the suitcase, then returned to the car and drove away. Police recovered the suitcase. Inside it, they found saliva. DNA testing confirmed it matched Elijah Vue, a suitcase left at a donation bin the night before a toddler was reported missing, with the child's saliva inside it. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. 5 days after Elijah disappeared, on February 25th, a woman walking her dogs found a red and white plaid blanket in a ditch. The blanket, the one Elijah always carried, the comfort object, the thing a 3-year-old drags everywhere he goes. DNA testing confirmed his DNA was on that blanket. A blanket in a ditch. A suitcase at a donation bin. Both linked to Elijah by his own DNA, and yet, for 6 more months, no one could find him. The investigation continued. Orr and Vang sat in the Manitowoc County Jail on child neglect charges. Their attorneys said very little publicly. Both maintained they had nothing to do with Elijah's disappearance. The search teams kept looking. Most people will never hear about what investigators were quietly building during those 6 months. The Google search history, the maps, the specific geographic data that would later be submitted to a judge. But before we get to that, if you want to follow cases like this one, cases where the details matter and the story keeps moving, subscribe. Because this case did not end when search teams stopped finding new leads. It ended in a way no one wanted, and then it became something else entirely.
By the time September of 2024 arrived, Elijah Vue had been missing for 7 months.
He would have turned 4 years old during that time. His family marked that birthday without him. On a Saturday in early September, a deer hunter was walking private property in the town of Two Rivers, 3 miles northwest of the apartment where Elijah had last been seen. The area was thick with woods. Investigators had searched nearby locations before, multiple times. The hunter found human skeletal remains. He called police immediately. The Wisconsin Crime Lab began DNA testing. The remains included a skull and bones. Investigators notified Elijah's family the moment results came in. On September 13th, 2024, Two Rivers police confirmed what the city had feared since February. The remains were those of Elijah Vue. Captain Andrew Rotz said, "Elijah has been our top priority since he was reported missing on February 20th. The location where his remains were found was wooded, dense, and had been canvassed by search teams multiple times in previous months." Investigators noted the decomposition of the remains was consistent with the timing of his disappearance, which means that in all likelihood, Elijah had been there, in those woods, for months. 3 miles from where he was last seen. Elijah's aunt posted to the Remembering Elijah Vue Facebook page to thank the community for everything they had done. She did not need to say anything more than that. People in Two Rivers already understood what the discovery meant. The medical examiner's office filed its report. The cause of death was ruled homicide by unspecified means. The medical examination of Elijah Vue's remains told a story that went beyond what the cause of death ruling alone conveyed. Doctors determined that the toddler had suffered physical abuse, psychological and emotional maltreatment, neglect. All 3 compounded over a period of time that investigators said stretched back at least to January 1st of 2024. But there was something else. Doctors found healed fractures on Elijah's skull and on his right cheekbone. Healed, meaning the injuries had occurred weeks before his death and had already begun to recover inside his body. They were not injuries from after he disappeared. They were older. When Elijah had received an X-ray at 6 months old, there was no fracture, so investigators were able to establish a window. The skull injury happened sometime after that infant X-ray, and at least several weeks before his death. That kind of fracture in a toddler, in that location, medical professionals noted, it is typically associated with blunt force trauma, specifically consistent with patterns seen in cases of child abuse. And then there were the photographs. According to prosecutors, photos of Elijah, taken during the period he was in Vang's care, had been shared between Bauer and Vang over their phones. Those photos showed injuries, bruising on his neck, bruising on his elbow. Medical professionals who reviewed those photos stated the injuries were not consistent with an accidental fall. There was one more photograph that investigators found. It had been deleted from a device, but deletion is not erasure, not when trained investigators and forensic specialists are involved. The deleted photo was recovered. It showed Elijah blindfolded and bruised. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. A child abuse pediatrician reviewed the complete record. The messages, the photos, the history Bauer and Vang had provided to law enforcement about how they disciplined Elijah. The pediatrician filed a formal assessment. The word that pediatrician used was torture. Not neglect, not abuse, torture. The professional definition of that term encompasses physical assault combined with psychological mistreatment and neglect. All three applied to a 3-year-old. That was on record by October of 2024.
On October 17, 2024, the Manitowoc County District Attorney, Jacqueline Labrie,
held a press conference. The child neglect charges that had held Bauer and Vang in jail for 8 months were dropped. Not because the evidence was weak, because the evidence was now strong enough for something more serious. Jesse Vang was charged with physical abuse of a child, repeated acts causing death. He was charged with hiding a corpse. He was charged with resisting or obstructing an officer. If convicted of the physical abuse charge, Vang faces life in prison. Katrina Bohr was charged with chronic neglect of a child, with consequence of death. She was charged with neglecting a child and with resisting or obstructing an officer. Bohr faces up to 60 years in prison if convicted. Bond for Vang was set at $500,000. Bond for Bauer was set at $400,000, Labrie said. This has been a complex investigation involving meticulous review of hundreds of pages of police reports, video evidence, and other materials, she added. Elijah was a young boy whose life was tragically cut short, and his death has impacted not only his loved ones, but Two Rivers. The Two Rivers Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, and our partners in the FBI and Department of Justice at their first court appearances on the new charges. Both Bauer and Vang pleaded not guilty. They are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. That is the standard. That is how the system works, and it should. But here is what was laid out in the criminal complaint. About a minute after Vang called 911 to report Elijah missing, a message arrived from Bauer. According to investigators, that message, which had been deleted but was recovered, read, "Say, you guys were taking a nap and he left." And then, Jesse, listen. The way you word things is very important. That is not a message someone sends when their child is missing and they are scared. That is a message someone sends when they already know what happened and are trying to shape a story before investigators can find the seams. During the preliminary hearing for Jesse's Vang in November of 2024, a special agent named Justin Rogan testified about what investigators had found in Vang's Google account. Between February 18th and February 20th, 2024, the account showed Google Maps activity. The map had been zoomed in on a specific location near Christy Bob Lane in Two Rivers. That location is very near, where Elijah's remains were found. The defense argued that this was not enough to draw the inference that Vang had transported Elijah's body there. That it was a leap. That reasonable people could not connect those dots. The judge disagreed. Judge Anthony Lambrecht found sufficient probable cause and bound Vang over for trial. Investigators also noted that Vang was already familiar with the area near where the remains were found. He had visited that property the year prior, a man who knew the location. A Google Maps search of that same location the night before a toddler was reported missing. A suitcase with the toddler's DNA left at a donation bin on that same night. A deleted text message coaching the cover story 1 minute after the 911 call. Separately, the red plaid blanket, the one that belonged to Elijah, found in a ditch 5 days after he vanished. None of these are points of proof in isolation. Together, the prosecution's theory is that they form a pattern. The case goes to trial. A jury will ultimately decide. But what nobody could miss, what the whole country saw when the criminal complaint was published, is the image of a 3-year-old boy being punished for picking up someone's phone. A 3-year-old boy who was told he was not ready to go home. A 3-year-old boy whose mother texted that he still has temptations and whose caretaker responded that cold water was the punishment. Nobody said anything that stopped this. Nobody intervened in time. As of mid-2025, both cases are still working through the court system. Jesse Vang was bound over for trial. In November of 2024, status conferences have continued into 2025. As of March of 2025, another conference was scheduled for June to continue moving the process forward. Katrina Bohr pleaded not guilty to her charges. Her attorney reviewed a plea deal being offered by prosecutors. As of June of 2025, that review was still ongoing. A court hearing confirmed the defense needed additional time. Elijah's uncle opposed Bauer's request to modify her bond conditions. He said she should remain in custody until the family knows where Elijah was and what happened to him. Now they know where he was, 3 miles from where he went missing, in a wooded area that had been searched before. What they are still waiting for is a full accounting. In court. In December of 2024, a community group in Two Rivers organized a toy drive called Operation Elijah in his memory. The goal was to help local children in need. The Remembering Elijah Vue Facebook group coordinated it. People who never met this boy showed up. A 3-year-old boy in dinosaur shoes became the center of a community's grief and, eventually, its anger. Not because the story was rare, but because the things that were done to him were not hidden. They were documented. In text messages, in photographs, in search histories, in suitcases left at donation bins at night. This decision seemed small at the time. The decision to send a toddler to a man she barely knew to learn how to be a man. It was not small. Nothing about it was small. As of the summer of 2025, Jesse Vang faces trial on charges that carry a potential life sentence. Katrina Bohr is still in legal proceedings on charges that carry up to 60 years. The cases are not over, not even close. Elijah Vue was 3 years old. He had blonde hair and brown eyes. He wore dinosaur shoes and carried a plaid blanket. He was supposed to go home on February 23rd. His father stood in a courtroom and asked for answers. His community put his name on toy drives and Facebook pages because they did not know what else to do with the weight of what happened to him. The investigators who worked this case for months, who followed every tip and searched every wooded area and recovered deleted messages from destroyed devices. They built something in a courtroom, a case out of text messages and suitcases and Google Maps data, and the testimony of pediatric experts who looked at the evidence and used the word torture. Whether that case leads to convictions is not yet known. That is still ahead. What is already known is this. A 3-year-old boy spent the last days of his life in an apartment, where the adults around him measured his behavior against standards. no toddler can meet, where punishment was cold water and standing for hours and being told. He was not yet ready to go home, and when it was over, when something happened in that apartment that required a suitcase and a drive. Through the Wisconsin woods at night, the very first move was to pick up a phone and start working on the story. Elijah deserved better than the story they tried to tell. His family is still waiting to hear the one the court will write. The mice. Ing 6.